Earlier, when we were looking at a consumer's choice between consumption and leisure, we confronted the consumer with different wage rates and asked what sort of labor supply decision they would make. We did that in order to derive the supply of labor. We then did a similar exercise confronting the firm with different wages. And from that, we derived the firm's demand for labor. By analogy, now what we're going to do is confront this representative consumer with three different real interest rates and ask what will be that consumer's demand for current consumption, savings, and future consumption. We start with the real interest rate of R1, the red line, and we're going to raise the real interest rate. So this line is going to pivot up, and as before, it's always going to go through the endowment point because the consumer can always choose to just eat her endowment. Choose current consumption to be Y minus T and future consumption to be YF minus TF. So what we're going to do then is we're going to consider three different real interest rates, R1, R2, and R3. We assume that the consumer initially is going to be at point E when we have R1. And at point E, she consumes C1 today and CF1 tomorrow. When the real interest rate goes up from R1 to R2, we move to the black line. And we know that the consumer is going to move in this direction, in the northwest direction. How do we know that? Well, because if she chose E under the real interest rate R1, she could have chosen any of these points down here, but she didn't. She chose E. Therefore, we know that when the real interest rate goes up, she's going to move in the northwestern direction. Now that entails reducing current consumption and raising future consumption. So this is the pure substitution effect. A higher real interest rate reduces current consumption, increases savings, and therefore increases future consumption. And then the same thing will happen when we go to the next interest rate, R3, on the blue line. She will just move up in the same northwestern direction. So we now have 3 points, C1, C2, C3, associated with R1, R2, and R3. And so we can then plot the real interest rate on this axis, current consumption on the horizontal axis, and here we have the lower interest rate, R1, then R2, then R3, and we have C1, C2, and C3. Connect the dots, and what we get is the demand for current consumption. We could instead plot the demand for future consumption. But now the relative price, instead of being 1 plus R, is the inverse of that. It's 1 over 1 plus R. And so now with R1, R2, and R3, the 1 over 1 plus R is in reverse order. This is associated with R1, and we have CF1, R2, CF2, R3, CF3. And so what we get then is that the demand for future consumption is also downward sloping when what we have on this axis is the relative price of future consumption, 1 over 1 plus R. And finally, what we can do is plot the savings function. We know, if we go back to this picture, we can deduce what savings is, because savings is just going to be equal to income minus consumption. And so for each level of C, we have an S. So we have the same thing for S2, and S3. And what we'll see is that the amount of savings that the consumer engages in is going to vary as the real interest rate goes up. And that then enables us to plot the interest rate R1 against the savings level S1, R2 against S2, R3 against S3, and then we get this nice upward sloping savings function. So this is the supply of savings today as a function of 1 plus R, the real interest rate.